The Ninja Warriors released in arcades back in 1987 by Taito. It was a particularly special game in that, unlike many other arcades games, the Ninja Warriors had a triple widescreen. This was achieved by having a main display in between projected images of two other displays which were placed inside of the cabinet itself and used mirrors to reflect. And that's how, in a nutshell, that gave us the very unique widescreen and triple display, which by all accounts looked phenomenal back in its day. Of course, we had other games which also released in this year, which was 1987, such as Darius, which also used the same cabinet to achieve this widescreen effect. The game is a highly detailed one and is considered as a beat-em-up, although not the average beat-em-up, a merge between beat-em-up and perhaps run and gun. Sprites in the arcade game are finely detailed to a very high quality, and of course the main thing this game is known for is of course its music. It truly is one of the best, if not best, arcade tunes of all time, and likely worth playing for this alone. The aim of the game is fairly standard: attack oncoming enemies, which come in both directions from left to right, hit them down or throw shurikens which are limited. As you are attacked, you'll notice that your robot's disguise will slowly fall off and metal will begin to show, which looks really cool. The storyline is fairly generic of this era. In 1993, the American government have declared a martial law, and so as an attempt to bring society back to normal, rebellious scientists create robots to take down soldiers. Like I say, that dystopian theme is a big part of many arcade games of the 80s. It's almost like in the 1980s, arcade game designers could predict the future far beyond 1993. So after many people asking for the Ninja Warriors, today we are comparing every home conversion of it and establishing which version is actually the best next to the arcade release. I will note that if you're expecting to see the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom version here, it won't be here. The SNES version is considered as a follow-up or sequel, and it's a very different game entirely. Virgin published the Amstrad CPC's version of the Ninja Warriors and released it in 1989. It has been coded using the Amstrad CPC Zero mode, which has given us the very bright colours and finer detail. Now, notably, the game is presented in an attempted widescreen ratio, which actually looks fairly good here. I will note that the introduction music of the arcade game sounds pretty good on the CPC too. The gameplay itself isn't that great. It is sluggish as the screen scrolls to the right, and did notice fairly bad slowdowns whilst too much was happening all at once on the screen. We do have the option to play this version with two people like most other versions here, although I didn't attempt this as I didn't want to crash the game. Now, most disappointingly is that we have no option for in-game music at all with this release. We have fairly average sound effects which are quite mediocre. I did notice something though that the arcade game didn't have so much of in stage 1, and that was soldier after soldier launching grenades at you every few seconds. Another thing to note with the Amstrad's version is that whenever we're being attacked, we don't actually see the robot become invisible and just remains as a human form. It is also slightly sluggish to control and doesn't appear to let the player attack whilst jumping here. And it goes without saying we also have no voice synth with this version either. The ZX Spectrum conversion is very much like the Amstrad's version, but obviously displayed in monochrome black and white. There are two versions of the Ninja Warriors for the ZX Spectrum, the 48K release and the 128K release. I tested the 128K release for this video, so we get a fairly decent version of the arcade's music at the start of the game, but sadly this disappears once the game actually starts. Considering this version was a 128K release, I naturally assumed it would have music in-game, but it didn't. Sound effects are actually here though. What makes this version a slight better than Amstrad's version is simply that the game runs so much better for the Spectrum. There are slowdowns, don't get me wrong, but nothing compared to the CPC's version. In fact, I am inclined to say that the CPC version was likely a port of this version, but upgraded in colour of course. Everything here, including no ability to attack whilst jumping, is similar to the Amstrad's game. It wasn't out of the ordinary for the Amstrad to get lazy ports like this. The game does scroll fairly well though, and I gotta say it's particularly hard because once we die whilst we're even on the boss parts of the game, we need to then restart the level, and that can be very frustrating. The Amiga's 1989 Virgin Masteronic release has a mixed bag of lovers and haters. Some say it's a bad conversion, some will say it's near arcade perfection. Now, although the game looks nice, there is some kind of bug with this release, I think. The game loads up with great sounding music, and I'll consider this as perfect in that respect. The issue is that in-game there is no music, just sound effects, and very nicely done voice synth too. So I researched online if this game came with music in-game, and it seems to be a very confusing story. There is another video on YouTube of this game where the game actually has music, but others have issues getting it to work. If we press the help button on keyboard on the Amiga, we can see that we can either use the options menu to turn it on or off by using the M key. I tried both and was still actually left with just sound effects. I tried several emulators for this, including Denise, and also used WHD load as well as a few different ADF versions, but we are still left with just sound effects. So as for the gameplay and presentation itself, the game doesn't look bad. I was particularly impressed with the detail of the robot you control and those animations of when it jumps and lands. The ponytail goes up and down, which reflects the up and down motion. The robotic walk is also here, which looks fairly close to the arcade game. The movements that emulate the arcade game are definitely here. I was actually surprised that this release didn't have parallel scrolling either. I did find though that collision detection actually wasn't that great with this version, but when it was working fine, hitting and killing enemies did have the staggering back effects rather than just instantly disappearing like the 8-bit versions mainly did. This version also opens up with the introduction in storyline too. Now, this is very controversial ranking this C64 version over the Amigas, but this is the version I played as a kid. It's not a game that I played much of, but at the time, I thought the music was fantastic, and it still is really. One of my personal favourite SID tunes for sure. Thankfully, Random Access developed this game, and that's why we got a fairly decent version for the Commodore 64. Of course, it's not a groundbreaking version, but certainly is a decent enough 8-bit computer version. Something that this comes with is a fairly smooth game with no frame drops from what I've experienced. The backdrops are nicely done here and a slight above average for a C64 game from 1989. Something that did actually stand out in particular with this version is that we have two layers being used here. One that acts as the main walking area and another which acts as the sky behind the buildings. It actually looks fairly good for basic parallax scrolling, that is. Something I did appreciate with this port is that when we die, we get to continue from the same place. So of course, not arcade perfection by a long shot. For example, the robot isn't exposed when we get hit by enemies. There are no sound effects with this version either, although the music, as I say, is just awesome in this version. We do, however, have a nice widescreen effect with those large black borders above and below the gameplay area. It's nice to control, and we can even attack whilst jumping in this version. In comparison with the Amiga's version, I just felt that this was much smoother, easier to control, but like I say, a fairly controversial opinion there. We are moving on to another 16-bit home computer system now with the Atari ST's 1990 release. Although this conversion does suffer issues with not providing the best scrolling, in fact the Amiga's release had better score than this one. This version for one had music, which was easier to play in game with and easier to disable it too. We have nice widescreen presentation of the game and it just generally feels a little better in production value compared to the Amiga's version. It seems nicer to control and I think the sound effects here was actually better than the Amiga's offering too. Although I do say that the Amiga version had the best version of the music itself. The sounds of bullets being fired here with the Atari ST's port is actually amazing. The grenades exploding sounded pretty awesome too. The TurboGrafx-16 or PC Engine 1989 Japanese release direct from Taito isn't a bad version at all. Firstly, you will notice that yes, the visual side of things aren't as good as say the Amiga's version, but we firstly get an options menu here where we can increase or decrease difficulty levels, as well as incorporating a few other choices we can use, including who we get to play as in this game. Now, this was fairly difficult ranking this version above everything else so far. At the end of the day, this was a decent version to play. Hit collision detection was pretty spot on here too, whereas some other versions wasn't as perfect. The music sounds pretty good here too, as well as the sound effects. Something which most other conversions didn't have was turning into a robot or losing that human look as we are getting shot and hit at. So considering those things, we do have something a little bit more faithful to the original arcades game. Of course, the backdrops aren't the best, they are kinda dull for a PC Engine game that is, but it does play really well, and can honestly say this was one of the most enjoyable versions to play outside of the arcades game itself. One annoying thing, however, was when dying, instead of continuing from the point of death, it was just another case of restarting the stage again. And in first place, I have decided to place the Japanese 1993 Sega Mega CD released by Taito Corporation. Firstly, this truly is likely the best version for the music and sound effects side of things with Ninja Warriors. Although you do lose your human look, which isn't perfect, as I went through the entirety of stage 1, I didn't find my robotics was exposing after being hit. I then moved on to stage 2 when it began to vanish, and so was then able to see myself as a robot, which looks pretty awesome here. We also have a fairly good options menu here too, which again, just like the TurboGrafx version, we can choose between difficulty levels, and a few other options are also added here too. The game is a big visual upgrade compared to the PC Engine's version, without a doubt. In terms of movement, how your robot is animated, it looks fairly faithful to what it is attempting to imitate. The colours on this release are slightly on the darker side and not as bright as the 1987 arcade game, but it's likely the best home conversion of the game in my opinion. Everything flows smoothly here and no frame drop issues either. We do have an introduction video to the game with this release too, and you can watch it by accessing it through the options menu rather than the game automatically playing it for you when you boot it up. It also comes with parallax scrolling. Of course, the fine intricate detail of the arcade game isn't really here, but neither does any other home conversion of this game. And that's it for ranking the various different home conversions of the Ninja Warrior today. Did you have the same version I did growing up, which was the Commodore 64 version? Which version of the Ninja Warriors would you have personally placed in number 1? Anyways, if you're new to this series, I'm going to leave the playlist for everything I've covered so far with arcade home conversions. Anyways, until next time, thanks for watching.